For some reason, I don't hear the music. Up. I think when the people are getting the message about the recording, it stops the volume on the music video.
Oh, because it's,
I don't hear it right now, but it might be because people are coming into the room.
oh, it's now says it's recording. Yeah, I think there's a.
מרפיק מבעד לזכוכית, יש לנו ארץ, למה עוד אחת? בחוץ שקיעה של יום שני, ערבים מתפללים כי איזה חג. חבר לי מסע כזה בחור, מסתכל לי, רק רב צרות אבל ראשו חכם. שנינו במנוסה כל פוסס, הוא אומר, אתה גם אבא, אתה גם ילדה.
Join the meeting.
מבעד לזכוכית, בינתיים יש לו גישות, כן, כן. מוזר לך הוא יהיה מזר, נראה לו אנושי וגם פוחד. יש לי אישה, זאת האמא שלך, ניסה אולי נגיע עד מחר. לא נעד, לא נפיל, לא נשים למפרטים, לא נגיע לארץ חדשה. איך נגיע לארץ חדשה.
Welcome and good afternoon, everybody. Hope everybody's well. You were just listening to, if you don't know it, Shlomo Artzi live from Caesarea about 9 years ago, singing Eretz Chadasha, a song he wrote in 1988 from the album Home Yuli August. And it's one of my favorite songs, and I think very appropriate for today's topic, which we will get into in a few minutes. My name is Danny Schultz, as many of you know, and on behalf of the Westchester Jewish Council, I'm honored to be introducing today's event, part of WJC's very successful Israel Connection series. The WJC is an umbrella organization representing about 135 Jewish groups, schools, and synagogues in Westchester, the 8th largest Jewish community in the United States. And I'm proud to be a board member of WJC and chair of our Israel Affairs Committee, and I'm excited to dive into our topic today. As you know from the title of today's conversation, we will focus on the baffling and maybe not so baffling topic of not Israel and the United Nations, but Israel at the United Nations, past, present, and future. And we are very lucky to have with us today a long-standing veteran covering Israel on TV and in print, Mike Wagenheim. Mike reports on a wide spectrum of issues related to Israel and the Middle East from his posts in New York and Washington, D.C. He is the senior U.S. correspondent for I-24 News and a correspondent as well for JNS, the Jewish News Syndicate, and has access to headliners and decision makers impacting the U.S.-Israel relationship and the American Jewish community. He is a Philadelphia native, which is okay by me. He is a former sports broadcaster, and he still won't tell me what his favorite teams are, spending nearly a decade in New Orleans. At age 35, he decided to shift gears and landed in Israel for the first time as an Oleh Hadash. Now, I just want to know right now, was that your first trip?
The very first time I landed in Israel was with 4 suitcases and nothing else.
So you're clearly insane.
Very much so, yes.
He shortly thereafter started a new career in political journalism, working his way to I-24 News as a diplomatic correspondent, where he spent nearly 3 years covering the Knesset, Prime Minister's office, and the hottest political stories of the day. In late 2019, Mike transferred to I-24's New York bureau and now serves, as I said, as senior U.S. correspondent, responsible for covering all issues related to Israel and the Middle East, along with the American Jewish community. Mike has interviewed past Israeli prime ministers, chief rabbis, a former U.S. Secretary of State, apparently Superman, a Knesset member who came straight from the hospital, still hooked up to her IV,
That was one of my favorites.
There was a 24-hour shift on the Israeli election day, April 2019, 3 days in Philadelphia during the chaotic 2020 U.S. election and President Biden's inauguration. Mike has covered Christmas in Bethlehem, Purim in Hebron, Hanukkah in Shechem, Birkat Kohanim at the Kotel, the reopening of Jesus' tomb in the Old City, the aftermath of Hamas rocket strikes in Ashkelon, UN Security Council meetings, pro-Israel rallies, anti-Israel rallies, a New York Philharmonic performance, I like this one, at a former Nazi rocket development site. And he has been a number of times in the Oval Office and the Pentagon. And last but not least, Mike has broadcast from the Dean Dome, the Pauley Pavilion, and many other stadiums and arenas in between. We're going to get started now. And Mike, really appreciate you joining us today. I know you're going to run off, I think, to the United Nations right after this for a Holocaust remembrance.
Yeah, I'm actually at the UN right now. I'm in a soundproof booth here, but yeah, Yad Vashem is unveiling an exhibit here at the top of the hour. Danny Dayan is here. Secretary General Guterres is here, and so I'll skedaddle off to that when we're done. But I'm excited to be here. I appreciate the invite and appreciate everybody joining us today.
I hear you. All right. Well, who are you rooting for on Sunday?
You know what? It's interesting. I know this is difficult to believe. I don't really follow sports anymore. My life with kids and a high maintenance dog and an Israeli wife and two jobs and traveling all over. I just don't have time for it. So every now and again, as I'm flipping through the channels, I may catch a minute or two of a game, but the game now is politics and diplomacy, and it's just as dirty and everybody's cheating to win. It's in some ways, it's the same life, just a different venue.
So tell us just for a second before we dive headfirst into the topic, what was your first experience with Israel or in Israel? I mean, how did you come to this decision, as you just told us, that your first trip was with 4 suitcases?
Politics was always my second love behind sports, and it was my minor in college. I minored in American politics and policy. And I loved my job in sportscasting, got to travel all over the world. It's a really cool job for a guy to have, being on TV and radio and talking about sports all day. But it can also lead to burnout. You're constantly on planes, constantly on buses. You have no control over your schedule. And I was in my mid-30s and decided that I didn't want to die in a press box like other people, and decided it was time to pursue other passions in life. I applied to be a diplomat at the State Department. They have a very rigorous exam, made it through the first level, but the second level, I didn't make it through. They said, you need more international experience. So while I broadcast from Canada every now and again, they said, no, that doesn't cut it. So they suggested I sign up for the Peace Corps. And I figured, why not? Good opportunity. I got assigned to Ukraine. And a few months before I was going to hand in my resignation at work, Putin invaded Ukraine. We're still talking about this years later, invaded Crimea. And they wound up airlifting the Peace Corps volunteers out of Ukraine, fearing that they might be caught in war. They literally, like a movie, airlifted them out of there, shut down the program. I was offered some other opportunities. Nothing really fit with the Peace Corps. And I figured I've got to move on with my life. So I started looking for other opportunities, and just a random Google search, Americans living overseas. I'd never been to Israel, hadn't been into a synagogue since my bar mitzvah.
Join the meeting.
I started learning more about Israel because it popped up on the list of large American expat populations. And I just got hooked by the idea of making Aliyah. Went through the process. I had a broadcast out in Los Angeles. I visited the Jewish agency there to file my paperwork while I was there. And with no job lined up and no connections and no family there, I just hopped on a Nefesh B'Nefesh flight and started life again. And thank God, found success.
Kol hakavod to you. That is
Todarova.
Fantastic. I'm in the venture capital business. You're a risk taker. That's pretty good. I like that. What year was that, if I may ask?
2015, I made Aliyah, August 26, 2015.
2015. Fantastic. Well, with that background, I'm going to suggest that we dive into our topic, and let's see if I can do this, because I think whenever anybody who has any knowledge or understanding of Israel and the UN thinks back, at least I do, maybe I'm showing my age, I remember quite vividly and can hear his voice today, the voice of Abba Eben, in my own mind at this very second. So I think maybe to set the stage just for a second, then I'll turn it back over to you. We're going to play a little clip from the great Abba Eban, and let's bring that up. Bear with me just a half a second here, and let's see if I am able to do this. Boom. And roll them.
That seemed to be a view held outside Israel, that you should at least give a commitment that your withdrawal should be to frontiers only slightly different to the ones that you had before the Six-Day War.
Well, that's a matter to be decided in the negotiation. The commitments are the result of negotiation. They are not the prelude to negotiation. Let us see what the changes are, and then let's describe them or photograph them afterwards.
You will give
In any
no
case,
commitment before negotiation, even if it means no negotiations, even if it rules out negotiations for the Egyptians.
well, we're supposed to be having negotiations, but I've never heard of such a thing in my life, in which, in order to have negotiations, you give the result first. Now, what is really happening? The United Arab Republic is saying you can have an agreement with the UAR, provided the UAR or Dr. Yaring write every single word of the agreement, and Israel's contribution to the agreement must be its signature on the dotted line. Now, that is frivolous, that is unprecedented. We are not the passive object, we must be the active partner in the peace agreement. There's something so surrealistic about what's been going on in the past 2 months that rational men might be unable to seize it. Here you have what is called a negotiation, in which the parties never meet, in which one party refuses to accept written communications from the other. And then you end up with a proposal that Israel's role in this negotiation is to sign blindly, without comment or modification, documents presented by others. Our future is at stake. Our men, our women, our children. I've never heard.
So, with those eloquent words reverberating for all of us, Mike, let me turn it over to you. I know you've prepared some remarks. Everyone should know that you can, as usual, put your questions in the chat window. We will get to you. We'll do our best to get to you. I think we're going to fill the full hour here. Mike will kick off, pardon the use of appropriate seasonal language. Mike will kick off, and then he and I will have a conversation. We'll turn to Q&A.
Yeah, I've been around the UN for a few years. There's nobody I've heard who comes close to the eloquence of Abba Eban. It's not even close. I want to go through a little bit of the history here of Israel at the UN, because we need to start with a foundation here. So let me share with you here. Is it popping up? Yes, it is. So this sets the foundation. This quote from Ambassador Eban. If Algeria,
just if you would, just click that.
I thought I did. There we go.
There you go.
If Algeria introduced a resolution declaring that the earth was flat and Israel had flattened it, it would pass by a vote of 164 to 13 there with a certain number of abstentions. That was true when he said it, and it's absolutely true now. So in that sense, nothing has changed at the UN. There has been almost from the beginning an automatic majority that will go against Israel every step of the way, no matter how ludicrous, no matter how minor the subject, no matter how much the truth must be stretched. That majority is there. We'll talk a little bit about the edges of that and what's going on in the periphery, but that's a good foundation with which to start when you think about Israel and the UN. I want to go over some key moments here. The information is there for your disposal. Some key moments in Israel's UN history. May 15th, 1947, there's a special committee on Palestine that was going to make recommendations as to how to move forward once the British were to withdraw from the mandate of Palestine. There's a final report issued later that year. 7 members of that committee voted in favor of the partition plan to divide it into a Jewish and an Arab state, with the city of Jerusalem, an internationally held city. The Palestinian Arabs, the Arab League, all rejected it. Shocker. Later that year, the General Assembly then passed Resolution 181. That was the partition plan for Palestine. That went into effect, 33 votes in favor, 13 against. It got the 2/3 majority necessary. Again, rejected by the Palestinian Arabs, rejected by the Arab League as well. There was Lausanne Conference in Switzerland in 49 to settle the problem of Palestinian refugees. I don't know if you've been keeping up with the news. That problem is not settled, not even close, and there's been absolutely no progress since. So on comes UNRWA, which we still know to this day. It was created in 1949, has obviously shifted its priorities, but the Palestinian refugee problem continues to grow, much to the consternation of Israel, who says that, UNRWA is the only one that counts refugees to the 4th and 5th and 6th generation, and obviously that population is not going down anytime soon. Some other key moments here: UN Security Council Resolution 242, passed in the wake of the Six-Day War. This is the basis. That Security Council resolution was the basis for land for peace. That's what we know is still on the table. You withdraw from land, you get peace in return. That set the stage for the Israel-Egypt peace treaty. But there is something in there, a historical footnote, but very, very important. There was some wording in that Security Council resolution which opened up the door to all kinds of confusion and all kinds of wiggle room for Israel. Instead of saying all territories, Israel will withdraw from all territories that it, quote unquote, occupies, it said the territories. Well, why is that a big deal? Because it means that Israel can claim that it can still hold on to some, legally claim that it can still hold on to some of that land. And that opens up the opportunity for land swaps. It opens up the opportunity for negotiations rather than just a one-sided, you're the occupier, you've got occupation over all this land, all of it, and you need to go. And that resolution also called for a just settlement of the refugee problem, obviously easier said than done. Also starting in 1974, those 67 territories, as we know them, were started to be called occupied Arab territories. Why is that important? Because the UN laid the groundwork for it to be called the occupied Arab territories. That means, by definition, Israel is the occupier, the Arabs, in this case, the Palestinians or the Syrians up in the Golan Heights, are the occupied. That sets the foundation for a whole range of actions taken by the UN over history that has had a detrimental effect on Israel in the international community, something the diplomats here are fighting on an everyday basis. It later became known as the occupied Palestinian territories. Interesting to note, when Jordan had control of Judea and Samaria in the eastern part of Jerusalem, was not considered occupied territory. You can draw your own conclusions from that. 1975, the Committee on the Exercise of Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People was created, and then the UN Division for Palestinian Rights in 1977. Right now, I counted, I don't know how many officially there are, I counted at least 20 different bodies, committees, organizations, agencies, what have you, that have the name Palestinian in them and take action on behalf of the Palestinian people or the Palestinian government. The one in 75 created a whole domino effect. There's obviously a lot of money and influence that goes into those particular bodies. 77, the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian People was created. By the way, that day is celebrated every year here at the UN. It's also known as Nakba Day to the Palestinians. Israeli ambassador to the UN, Gilad Erdan, remarked this past year that it is the only day that the UN will sponsor that celebrates the potential destruction of another country, another UN member state. And that's an interesting way to think about it. We move on to the 75 UN resolutions, 3379. Zionism is racism. I was withdrawn eventually, but obviously caused a huge firestorm at the time. The Israeli ambassador Chaim Herzog said it was based on hatred, falsehood, and arrogance. The US stepped up to the plate as well. Daniel Moynihan was the ambassador at that time and absolutely obliterated the UN for passing that Zionism is racism resolution. 79, Israel-Egypt peace treaty. Interesting to note that peace treaty signed and initiated by Anwar Sadat went around the UN. The UN had failed repeatedly to bring about a peace between Egypt and Israel. Once they got outside of UN channels outside of the Geneva Conference, they were able to make peace. Again, you can draw your own conclusions from that, but the UN has been accused credibly many times of standing in the way of peace rather than facilitating it, a point that Israeli ambassadors make on a fairly regular occasion. Camp David Accords, not the treaty itself, but the Accords touched on the issue of Palestinian statehood. It was supposed to be a cooperative effort to try to establish a Palestinian state, still on that particular problem. Following the 93 Oslo Accords and the 94 Israel-Jordan Peace Treaty, the language of the yearly General Assembly resolutions were modified. They were toned down in terms of its criticism of Israel. So Oslo gave hope, not only gave hope to Israel, gave hope to the Palestinians at the time, or some of Israel were happy about the Accords. The international community saw it as a viable road to peace, and they rewarded the Israelis for coming to the table and compromising on a lot of difficult issues in the Oslo Accords. And so they started to tone down the regular and pretty rampant condemnation of Israel at the UN that was happening at the time. With the failure of Oslo, that obviously didn't last as long as we had hoped for. On July 26, 2002, U.S. Ambassador John Negroponte stated during, and there's no record of this, but it was taken down by members of the council at the time. It was a closed meeting. He said, the U.S. will oppose any Security Council resolutions that have to deal with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict if they only condemn Israel. All future resolutions would require those points that are on the screen in front of you. That became known as the Negroponte Doctrine. And it's still, generally speaking, 98% of the time, followed by the U.S. They continue to use their veto power, with one exception that I'll talk about in a bit, to make sure that any resolutions that have to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, if they're going to make it through the Security Council and go around a veto of the U.S., they have to be balanced. They cannot blame Israel and blame Israel solely for problems of the conflict, and they have to put the onus on the Palestinians to control or eliminate terrorism and activities that promote terrorist activity against Israel. Very, very important point there at the UN in terms of U.S. protection of Israel here in this building. However, in late 2016, with obviously personal issues between then Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and then President Barack Obama, the U.S. failed to veto and instead chose to abstain on UN Security Council Resolution 2334. That called out the Israeli settlements in Judea and Samaria as illegal. It also had the effect of avoiding a Jewish foothold and Jewish connection to the old city and the Jewish holy sites there. It essentially declared even those occupied territory. Obviously, a very tense and harmful moment in U.S.-Israel relations, something that a lot of people still haven't forgotten about or haven't forgiven all these years later. So I'll stop there in terms of key moments, and I'll turn it back over to you, Danny.
Okay, I appreciate it, and that was fantastic. And I have to admit, even I would imagine for those of us who know a lot about Israel at the UN, there were some nuances there that were quite new to me. So I want to reach back before the existence maybe of the United Nations and ask you a question. It may be challenging, I don't know, but to what extent do you feel that Israel's challenges at the UN maybe predate the UN and the partition plan? Can we go back further to some period, sort of, post-Balfour Declaration, sort of post-World War I, and decisions made by European parliaments? Or, and I want to get to be too much of a historian conversation here, but are there elements of that really were the recipe for problems from our point of view from before the United Nations?
The world, when the United Nations was created, not even going back to World War I, but just when the UN itself was created in the post-League of Nations era, is much different than what we see now. Colonialism is obviously taken a back seat. There's the membership of the UN since that time has exploded as new nations joined and others were created, sometimes out of thin air, sometimes by the ex-colonialists who created a whole mess in the Middle East in terms of the maps that they drew. Some of those, foundations were set way back when. The strife that was created by the Europeans in the Middle East, the chaos that they left when they withdrew from certain areas, has had obviously an incredibly it's led to a constant war, constant conflict, constant humanitarian crises. And a lot of those, rather than being pinned on the warlords and the leaders that implement those crises and those genocides in the region, are pinned on Israel for matters of whatever you want to call it, anti-Semitism, a feeling that they shouldn't be here, that the Jews shouldn't be here, that they shouldn't have a state of their own. So those problems go way back when. They're not of a different nature, I don't feel. Anti-Semitism is anti-Semitism. Jew hatred is Jew hatred. But yes, the foundations for the challenges that Israel faces here at the United Nations were laid well before Israel was a state, well before Israel joined as a member.
Right. No, I hear you. I appreciate that. So was there a period of years where, I guess, the membership, I mean, obviously Israel was voted into existence, right, at the United Nations. So was there a period of years where the membership and voting patterns of the UN member countries began to shift more dramatically as sort of member states were added to the roster of voting countries, where that sort of dramatically turned against Israel in those years? Conventional, I would say, Jewish thinking would cite the rapid expansion of member countries, but is that correct? And around when might that have been?
Yeah, at one point, there was a shift in the UN in terms of the way things were organized. And the UN, and it still holds true to this day, was divided into what are called regional groups. And those regional groups were developed in order to make sure that the agencies and all the various bodies and committees throughout the UN had proportional representation from around the world. So it wasn't all, American led efforts in one committee, and this committee wasn't dominated by China, and this one wasn't dominant, that every part of the world would have, a relatively a proportional say in what's going on in any particular committee, any particular body. Well, where does Israel fit into one of those regional groups? Well, they're in the Middle East. Well, until recently, at least, Israel was considered persona non grata in the Middle East. So the ones that rule the Middle East are the Arabs. They control that working group, that Asian working group, and they wanted no part of Israel. So Israel, still to this day, cannot sit on certain committees, cannot touch certain agendas, including racism at the UN, because they only belong as essentially an observer member to the Western European group. The Western European group is the one that brought Israel into the fold, but only essentially as an observer. So still to this day, Israel is challenged by that working group. You also have to take into account oil and the Soviet Union's role. Once the Soviets turned against Israel, that laid loose a whole new set of problems in terms of a voting bloc. You take the Arabs, the Muslim Arabs, the Soviet Union. That's a humongous part of UN membership. If they're voting as a bloc against Israel, which they did for years and years, it's really tough to get anything going here in this building.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, and you've touched on it now, but I was curious if the shift in relationships among Israel, France, Russia, and the U.S. right before and after the Six-Day War really affected the balance of how Israel worked within the UN and how other countries worked with Israel. And it sounds like that is the case. But I would think that the Russian bloc would have driven more European countries to ally with Israel more closely. Is that true, or is that not the case?
You're talking about the Soviet Union?
Yes, and as the Soviet Union began to push its weight around for the communist bloc countries to vote a certain way, I would think, and that was a period also, though, where I guess Israel and France their relationship began to fray. But I would imagine that the rest of that, nonetheless, Israel and Europe, I would think at the UN remain very close, but I'm not sure. I don't know.
It's not just the U.S. and the Saudis that have this old security for oil relationship. That is true in other parts of the world as well. And the Soviet Union found their interest lied elsewhere, not with Israel, which really couldn't offer, much at the time. Israel was not a military power at that time. It was not an innovative power at that time. It was essentially a child holding on for survival. The Soviet Union found its interest lied elsewhere, and its protection and vice versa lied elsewhere, and it lied with the Arab bloc, it lied with the Muslim bloc. And so they're not coming to bat for Israel and going up against the Arab world. It would lead to economic consequences. It would lead to security consequences. And this building is very much allied and circled around shared interest. We hear that term a lot, shared interest. So it's not always what's right. It's not always what's just. In fact, it's usually just the opposite. It's what can you do for me and what can I do for you? And if something else gets in the way, too bad. That is how things are run here at the United Nations. And Israel was and still is a victim of that mentality and that reality to this day.
So that's interesting. We're going to come back to that point because I think there's some interesting things that have happened recently and are still happening that are beginning to sort of turn that a bit. But I want to get into some figures. I don't mean numbers, but individuals. So other than Abba Eban, who are considered Israel's, I suppose, most successful UN ambassadors, and then as an adjunct to that, were there particular prime ministers that had a very effective strategy looking back in engaging with the UN?
I want to actually take a look at two recent ambassadors because it's interesting. Over the last 5-ish years here at the UN, things have started to turn a little bit. And when you look at what it was, those things don't become so microscopic. So I want to pull up my screen here again. I'll share it with you guys. Oops. I believe I forgot to share, so let me do that now.
Right.
Okay. All right, so Danny I'm thinking who I need to go meet in a little bit. Danny Danon was appointed Israeli ambassador to the UN before the current ambassador came into office here. Danon took a different tact than what we had seen out of prior ambassadors. Prior ambassadors, rightfully so, were always ready for a fight. We're always ready to be challenged and to counter punch. And Danon, who, by the way, was thought of as a firebrand MK, a member of Knesset himself, surprisingly, when he came in here to the UN, decided to take a much different tact and a much different posture. And he decided, we are going to find success in areas where we can cooperate. Cooperation became a prime factor in his mission here rather than always counterpunching. It was a part of it, but it became less and less important because he knew 95% of the battles he wasn't going to win and had no chance of winning. So let's pick the spots where Israel can win and can advance, and let's focus effort and energy on that. And that is kind of followed through on the current ambassador. But Danon was able to gain recognition for Yom Kippur as an official UN holiday, acceptance to several committees. There were Israeli staffers that were appointed to a couple of different committees here. An international summit was developed here at the UN against BDS, which was very notable at the time. Danon became the first ever Israeli rep to chair a main UN committee. So there were a lot of things that he was able to accomplish. You look at it and say, oh, well, what's the big deal about an agricultural related resolution? Baby steps, because it just wasn't done before. They couldn't find the numbers here at the UN to implement those types of things. So you take note of the little victories and start to build on those and hope they become even more meaningful in the coming years. And Danon left here, and he's now back in the Knesset again with a pretty good track record of developing, Israel's bona fides here at the UN. The current ambassador, Gilad Erdan, kind of picked up on that. And a much more laid back ambassador, still can be fiery with his rhetoric, but not as combative in tone at times. Elected vice president of the General Assembly for this current session, very notable. First time Israel's been elected as a member of ECOSOC, which is the Economic and Social Committee here at the UN. It's one of the highest bodies. You don't hear a lot about it, but it's very influential here at the UN. It controls the purse strings. It controls other issues as well. And you see some other list of accomplishments here. And one notable one, last year, he led the resolution and got it through the General Assembly, a resolution to battle Holocaust denial and distortion here at the UN, which is a very important subject. So you're starting to see now, and I'm not sure if it'll carry through to the next one, starting to see now ambassadors take less of a focus on counterpunching and more about finding those areas of cooperation with not only natural allies, but some, countries that have they can find shared interests with. We come back to that term, shared interest, and pass through those resolutions, get the votes to get on those committees and start to develop Israeli influence here at the UN where it just wasn't really possible before.
So that's fascinating, and those successes are fascinating. I wonder who are some of the countries then. We'll touch on sort of the Abraham Accords in a second. It's an obvious topic to discuss, but who then might be some of the countries that maybe either are obvious or not obvious when you say that there are a number of these committee roles or recognition days or chairmanships, et cetera? Who are the countries that, I don't know, we might not think of as normally that are in fact quietly very supportive of Israel now?
Well, you're starting to see a lot of the Eastern European countries,
Right.
Czech Republic, Hungary, the Visegrad countries, Africa as well. Israel has spent an enormous amount of diplomatic and political capital visiting African countries, developing relationships there. And both Danon and Erdogan have used a lot of innovative diplomacy. And I'm not talking about the style of it. I'm talking about actual innovation. Let's trade our innovation, Israel's innovation, water technology, agricultural development, all the things that developing countries need to survive, especially in the climate technology is another one that Israel's exporting. Let's give you what you need. You give us support here at the UN in return. It's not always going to be 100% support, and it's not always going to be public support. But even if we can develop those relationships and rely on you, whatever country it is, a certain amount of time in a certain number of situations, well, then it's worth it in the end. Shared interest, that comes back to that. So if we can export our technology, you find it helpful, security technology, counterterrorism, Israel's got it all right now in terms of exports. That's how they're starting to develop these relationships and build it. Western Europe, not as obviously supportive as Israel would like, though it comes at times, but we're starting to see Eastern Europe, Africa be more and more supportive of Israel at the UN.
Yeah, those are some interesting observations about, I mean, the efforts in Africa have been decades in the works. So talk about making a long-term investment, but it seems like they're critical and paying off now. Maybe you could talk a little bit about, there's I mean, you're going to come back to it, and you mentioned the U.S. voting pattern in the United Nations with respect to Israel. I think there's, I may be wrong on this, but one abstention rather than veto in the last sort of 10 years or so. But talk a little bit about different U.S. administrations, and there's not a discussion of sort of U.S. politics, but how Israel has been treated and scolded or treated as an ally and elevated in sort of the last decade, because then what I want to do is project out the next decade.
Part of what I try to do as a correspondent is to, when I get off the air or get off of a Zoom call with people, I'm happy if they don't know my political persuasions. And so whatever I'm telling you is simply based in fact. If you want to talk privately, we can talk about my own politics. But I think Israel was very, very scared when the Biden administration took over, based on some of the language coming out of the campaign, based on some of the administrative personnel that were hired within the White House, within the State Department, as to how things were going to look here at the UN. By and large, I think Israel has been pleasantly surprised. Linda Thomas Greenfield, the ambassador here, came in saying, screaming from the rooftops, essentially, to the point where it's like, well, what are you making all this noise about? It's like, it should be alarming at this point, how much she was going to the hilt to defend Israel here at the UN, and they'd always have Israel's back here at the UN. It was almost like she was screaming it too loudly. There was room for concern. It's turned out to be the case. Every critical resolution of Israel here at the United Nations, America has had Israel's back under the Biden administration. During the Gaza conflict last year, the State Department killed precious days, killing time here at the Security Council, trying to find a diplomatic resolution to the conflict before some of Israel's enemies on the Security Council could bring forth a resolution condemning Israel. And at the end, there was nothing on the table. The conflict was, at least that conflict, was resolved before there could really be any kind of Security Council action. It made it a moot point. That was really the first big test of the Biden administration's pledged commitment to Israel here at the UN. Now, of course, it doesn't rival what the Trump administration did for Israel, not only in matters outside this building, but here. Nikki Haley and Kelly Craft, following her, took pleasure and made it a prime focus of theirs to make sure that Israel was supported here at the United Nations. If you want to go back further than that, that abstention by the Obama administration essentially defined their tenure here at the UN with Israel. Maybe not fair. You look at the memorandum of understanding that was signed defense-wise with Israel under the Obama administration, but that you taste a bad dessert, it doesn't matter how good the dinner is. You leave the restaurant with a bad taste. That was the last action taken by the Obama administration vis-a-vis Israel. It was in the waning days of the administration, and it just left a lasting legacy. So by and large, the Negroponte doctrine is, except for that one abstention, still holding up in one form or fashion.
Right. I hear you. And it's interesting, people do, and I understand it, focus on that conflict with the Obama administration. I did ask earlier if there, other than ambassadors, were there any styles or strategies of prime ministers that also exacerbated conflict? And I'm sure there are some people on our call and others who might want to wade into that discussion with respect to the Obama abstention. I'm not going to get into that. As you, I'm going to leave my politics at the mouse, shall we say. But let's do the obvious, though. Let's turn to the Abraham Accords and Israel-Arab country relations and the UN. Clearly the price of oil always is important, and you pointed that out with respect to what was going on in the early 70s with Israel at the UN. But talk a little bit about the Abraham Accords and how Israel, it probably has enabled Danone and Erdogan to do many of the things that they have been able to, as well as the independence of the Eastern Bloc countries and the African countries. But maybe you can address that.
It's a really interesting dichotomy, Danny, because what the Abraham Accords have done here at the UN is opened up a door for Israel to go to other countries and say, we are not isolated anymore. There's no reason to fear having open relations with us. There's no penalty to pay anymore. And we can find peace and we can find friendship. If we can find it with our Gulf neighbors, we can find it with anybody. On the flip side of that, from my vantage point, the relationship with the United Arab Emirates and to a certain extension, Bahrain, hasn't gotten much better here at the UN. The voting patterns amongst the Abraham Accords countries haven't changed. And in fact, the UAE sits on the Security Council right now. And just a couple of weeks ago, when the Israeli National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, went up to the Temple Mount, controversially, rightly or wrongly, the UAE was the one, on behalf of the Palestinians, that filed for an emergency meeting here at the UN and the Security Council to talk about that visit. and claimed in its document to the UN Security Council that Ben-Gvir, quote unquote, stormed Al-Aqsa, which, whatever you think about Itamar Ben-Gvir, and there are divergent opinions, obviously, he didn't storm anything. He took a leisurely stroll for 13 minutes without incident. So those things still exist. So yes, there's economic cooperation. Yes, it changes other things here at the UN, but it has not changed, ironically, any voting pattern. From the UAE, from Bahrain, from Morocco, they still consistently vote against Israel here at the UN on any number of matters.
So, I could imagine that's a strategy potentially because of those countries who've sort of normalized more economically. So perhaps one way to create some balance and ballast for themselves amongst Palestinians and others is to continue to, saber rattle. I don't know.
Well, there's one Security Council seat that is unofficially reserved for a member of the Arab world. So every Security Council election, there's going to be an Arab country on there. And what the Arab League, and to an extension, the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, has decided is that whoever holds that seat speaks for everybody. You represent the Arab world with that Security Council seat. And so it's very, very difficult
Sure.
To defending the UAE for a moment here in their voting pattern to break with the rest of the Arab world who hasn't yet signed on the dotted line with Israel, the rest of the Muslim world that hasn't signed on the dotted line, and say, you know what, they're okay. Lay off of Israel for a minute. It's very, very difficult when you are decidedly representing that humongous bloc that is still very much anti-Israel to suddenly change and go with the flow.
Yeah, you're representing the bloc, not your own country's economic interests. So I think that's a great point. So right before we open it up for questions, and I like our pace here, I have one last question for you, at least on this subject, which is now I'm going to ask you to sort of project out, and maybe you want to give an upside case, a base case, an upside and a downside case. But what's possible? Well, actually, let me take a step back. There was one other thing I wanted to ask. Does it matter? One thing I miss is all these resolutions. I'd love to see a bar chart of sort of the resolutions. Maybe one year we'll see the number of resolutions against Israel going down. But just very quickly, is there practical import to these resolutions at all? There is in the world of public opinion. I get that, but I don't know.
So some of these resolutions are binding.
Okay.
Security Council resolutions are binding, and in some cases have the force of international law. General Assembly resolutions are non-binding. We didn't even talk about the Human Rights Council, which is just a cesspool of anti-Israel activity. They pass more resolutions against Israel there than the rest of the world combined, on a yearly basis. Does it matter? Yes, it does in the extremes. Meaning if it gets so bad here at the UN, or if it ever got so bad, if Israel lost the support of the US, for instance, we're talking about Israelis being tried at The Hague. That's real. That's not public opinion. That has real consequences. So when we talk about the extremes, yes, it has an impact. But also, we kind of brush off public opinion sometimes. Public opinion matters. Public opinion steers a whole lot of conversation, steers a whole lot of debate. And while it may not have the consequences of an Israeli at the dock, it still has, other impacts in terms of economics, in terms of security. So the resolutions maybe themselves don't matter, but Israel's presence at the UN and how it's able to manage its relationships at the UN, that still matters a whole lot.
Right. Who's the second most censured and hated country at the UN? Is there anyone who stands out?
There's nobody who stands out. No, Iran is starting to become that country at this point, and the longer Ukraine, I don't even like calling it conflict, the longer Russia's invasion of Ukraine continues, I think we'll see more and more activity against Russia. No, every now and again you'll see Cuba or China or Venezuela, but Cuba and Venezuela are on the UN Human Rights Council. So no, there's no country that even comes close to Israel in terms of the number of negative resolutions that come out.
Gotcha. So 10 years out, 5 years out, even I'll make it. I don't know, but or all bets are off. I don't know.
There's so many. Listen, 5 years out, we could have 5 more Israeli elections, and
10. We could have 10.
It's so difficult when so many. I hate to pass the buck with so many variables, and the world changes so quickly, and interests change so quickly, and alliances. Who would have thought that the U.S. and Western Europe, and to some extent Eastern Europe, would be able to build the alliance the way they built it vis-a-vis Ukraine and Russia in such a short amount of time with those divergent interests. So things change so rapidly. That is the challenge here for Israel, is trying to use those amazing minds within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to kind of lay out where things are headed 1, 2, 3 years down the road, probably, as far as they can see out, to try to manage these relationships and make sure that Israel is where it needs to be diplomatically for the future. It's too difficult a question.
No, fair enough. Let's turn to some questions here. And Mike Middleman's got a great question we didn't really hit on. Any changes in any direction or developments with respect to UNRWA? Or any attitude changes from other nations about UNRWA?
Yeah, we've seen several European countries cut off funding for UNRWA, including a couple of surprises in there. I mean, countries that are generally very supportive of the Palestinian cause. That's because we're seeing anti-Semitic textbooks that are distributed in UNRWA schools. We're seeing UNRWA not doing enough to weed out, Hamas agents, essentially, that are infiltrating UNRWA agencies and other problematic points of UNRWA. So some of that funding has been shockingly cut off from Europe. At the same time, the Biden administration, in trying to restore relations with the Palestinians, restored all that funding to UNRWA. So some of the dynamics have changed, but if you look at the overall picture, UNRWA is in trouble not because of this country is in or this country is out. UNRWA is in trouble for the same problems that were at its very foundation, which is that every Palestinian that is born at any place in the world at any given time obtains the status of a refugee and obtains the rights therein, the economic rights of getting the money that a refugee any place else in the world would get. The population keeps growing and the funding can't keep up. That's UNRWA's main problem.
Interesting. Questions, folks? Have we been that good? Have we answered all your questions? Let me, while people are scratching their heads, have any events between Israel and the U.S., like the USS, the sinking of the USS Liberty, I guess, at the end of the 6-Day War, or even, I suppose we already touched on this, but Netanyahu speaking in the U.S. Capitol. Have there been any things that have, with respect to the U.S. And Israel, have really affected Israel at the United Nations? Or do we kind of deal with those things between ourselves and try to not let it impinge on the insanity in Manhattan?
It's a good question. There are many things that are said in private channels. There are many things that are dealt with behind the scenes, different conflicts, different slights, different insults, some minor, some major, that are dealt with before they rise to the level of being publicized here at the UN. So a lot of these things we just don't know about. What was true 5 years ago is no longer true here at the UN. So what was true 35, 40 years ago is no longer true here at the UN. A lot of it's like, what do they talk about when you're the president? if the only problems that rise to the president are ones that couldn't be solved by anybody else, right? That's the same thing here at the UN. The only problems that are dealt with here are the ones that couldn't be dealt with somewhere else. And that's what makes this place so interesting. And it's also what makes it so frustrating that a lot of these problems still can't be solved even here. I think somebody had a question about India.
Yeah, great question. Actually, I really like this, Jonathan. Any chance that India begins to vote, with Israel at the UN, or maybe not against Israel at the UN?
Yeah, I think we started to see it. And India just stepped down. Its term ended at the Security Council, 27 days ago. Yeah, Modi and Netanyahu developed a very close relationship in Netanyahu's previous term as prime minister, and it really did carry over here to the UN. You look at a country like India, which is a natural in terms of its geographic location, in terms of its demographics, to go against Israel here in international forum would be a classic anti-Israel country. But again, it's about developing those relationships. It's about finding cooperative points of interest. And I think Modi and Netanyahu, and to an extent, the ministries below them, were able to find those cooperative areas, and it did to a large extent carry through here to the UN. India can't be considered anymore an anti-Israel reflexively.
Right.
It hasn't flipped completely, but we're starting to see that wheel turn.
And any other countries, I guess, in the India model that are close followers potentially?
Not yet, but we hear publicly, we hear chatter, and privately we hear it as well, that there could be some Muslim countries that are ripe for signing, if it's not an Abraham Accord style deal, subnormalization agreement. I don't think it's that far away. Saudi Arabia may be a bridge too far. We heard Oman, but that turned out to be, that went nowhere. In fact, it went backward. But there are some of India's neighbors, influential neighbors.
Morocco, or too passive in that regard?
Morocco still hasn't gotten, and even though they're a monarchy, I think they still feel they need support from the street. And they don't have support from the street right now in terms of turning that relationship into something that can be developed more publicly. So it'll take time. The Abraham Accords were such a shock to the system, but those things, just because you get a signature on a piece of paper, it doesn't automatically make you the closest friend in the world.
Certainly.
We'll see Morocco turn, but it's not right yet.
All right. Well, listen, I know you have to run to a very important event, and I really want to thank you. This was great. And I guess we covered everything we had. Those were two excellent questions, though. So frankly, everybody, with that, thanks again, Mike. We're going to wrap things up. Stay tuned, folks, for more of our Israel Connection series. And I do want to make mention, and maybe Helene or somebody can put the link in the chat. But this coming February 4th, so 2 Saturday evenings away, is the WJC Westchester Jewish Council Gala. It'll be held at Congregation Kol Ami in White Plains. And there's also a link on the WJC website, but there are going to be about 400 people there as of now. So great turnout. We're very excited, and come join us. And with that, thank you all, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks so much, everybody.